Afternoon. Welcome to the Palace Theatre for today's Understanding Russia presentation. My name is Aysy, I'm your activities manager for those who haven't met me yet. My full name is Aysy, my last name is Sadrislamova, and I do come to you from Russia with love. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm the activities manager on board in charge of the activities program, and today I've decided to make a personal presentation that I've put together about 3 years ago. I've been doing the Baltic season 3 summers in a row on the Serenade of the Seas, and this is when I've decided to put a presentation together about the Russian history. And I felt it was really useful for those of you who's going to St. Petersburg for the first time. And today's presentation, I'll be covering pretty much 1,000 years of history in 45 minutes. I'll try to make it 45 minutes. Now, I've been working for All Caribbean International for about 7 years now. I've been privileged to go to high school in the United States. I went to high school in West Virginia. Anyone from West Virginia? No? All right. So I went to high school there, and then I did my university degree in Russia, and I'm a teacher of English and German languages. And I love doing historical presentation. I love to study history. And today I'll be talking about my personal views. I'll be talking about the culture of Russia and the history of Russia. Now, when people ask me where I'm from, I tell them I'm from Russia. But when they ask me what's my nationality, I tell them I'm Tatar. How many of you heard about the Tatars? Okay, there we go. Very well. Now, it's one of the nationalities that we have in Russia, and I'm personally from the city called Naberezhny Chelny. Has anyone heard? No, that's all right. That's about 1,000 kilometers to the southeast of Moscow. So in this presentation, I'll be covering about the locations, different nationalities. I'll be talking about the culture in general. And the first thing that I would like to talk about is the political division of Russia. And not many people know that it's a Russian federation, so it's divided into different republics, oblasts, regions, and it's very similar to states or the counties in some countries. So this is the political division of Russia. If you can take a look, we've got republics, 46 oblasts, which is pretty much similar to provinces, 22 republics, and I'm from the republic called Tatarstan. So there's an arrow pointing location of the republic Tatarstan, and it's in a way very autonomous. The republics most of the times are very autonomous. We do have our very own president of Republic Tatarstan, who reports to the president of Russian Federation. We've got 2 official languages. We've got a Russian language and Tatar language is a completely different language. It belongs to Turkish family languages. But there are 2 official languages, so all the signs are in Tatar and in Russian, and it's taught at schools as well. And most of the times, republics do have 2 official languages, and it depends on the majority of nationalities that live there. So there's 22 different republics. There's 9 krais, essentially the same as oblasts, 4 autonomous okrugs, it's in a way autonomous districts, 1 autonomous oblast, which is called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, and 3 federal cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Sevastopol. Now, this is how the map, the political division of Russia looks like, if you can take a look at the screen. The next thing that I would like to talk about is my city, and I'm just going to briefly mention about it. I'm very proud of my city's production that is known for KAMAZ truck productions. How many of you heard of the KAMAZ trucks? Not many. So anyways, just to boost up the production of my city trucks, I would like to promote, this is a great truck. So if you're planning to buy a truck, it's very cheap. But here you can see a racing truck, and it's been winning in the Paris-Dakar races for 13 times in a row. Pretty much every single time they participate in the race, they win. Not even a single piece of that KAMAZ truck is Russian. They're all foreign, but they assemble it in Russia. And that's the picture of a truck when for the domestic usage, and we do export the truck to all the other cities and countries as well, to South America, to India, to China, and some of the ex-Soviet Union countries. Now, when we talk about nationalities and different ethnic groups, I have another map to show you that pretty much covers the largest ethnic groups of Russia. The population being 146.8 million people, we've got over 185 different ethnic groups, and it's quite a big melting pot when it comes to nationalities and different ethnic groups. Now, Slavic group is one of the biggest ethnic groups. It's 80% of the population. It includes Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and it will be in yellow color, as you can see in the map. We also have quite a big Mongol ethnic group. It's in light pink. It includes Burats in Siberia and Kalmyks. We've got quite a big Iranian ethnic groups. It's in dark pink, right there by the Caucasus Mountains. It includes Chechens, Ingush, Avars, Lezgins, Ossetians. And they are, we've got Ossetin Republic, we've got Chechen Republic, so they all divided politically into the republics. We've got Finno-Ugric, quite a big Finno-Ugric ethnic groups, which is an orange color. It includes Finnish, Karelians, Komis, Samis in the north of European Russia, and Mari, Mordovians in the Volga region, and Khanty and Mansi in the further east area. We've got a big Turkish ethnic groups, which is in purple. It includes my nationality, Tatars, Chuvas, Bashkirs, and etc. Now, each nation tries to preserve their own national identity, the traditions, the customs, the language. For example, in my republic, we celebrate Tatar traditional holidays, we celebrate Russian holidays. So it's quite a mixture, and for every single region, they try to preserve all the traditions and maintain the national identity. The next quote that I'm about to bring forward, and this is when we will start talking about the Russian history, that I find quite fascinating, that Winston Churchill said about Russia. He said, "Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." Russians do puzzle me sometimes, and I do agree. And it's quite it's such a nation that's been closed off from the rest of the world for a certain period of time, certain historical eras. And he said that, of course, during his Prime Minister time in the UK. And understanding Russians could be sometimes very tricky. First of all, I find them very serious. They don't smile a lot. I think I'm the only smiley representatives of Russian people. But they don't smile, and I blame the weather. To be honest, I think in the warmer regions, people tend to smile more often and they tend to be more happy. But this is one of the reasons I find them quite stiff and reserved. Also, I can spot a Russian anywhere in the world, just the way they dress, the way they look at people. I find that they like to stare at people. I don't know if you might notice that in Russia. But also, one of the reasons why they don't smile, but because we used to have historically lots of proverbs about smiling being a foolish. So they would say, if you smile too much, you're a fool. So that might also be one of the reasons why Russians don't smile too much. And the other big reason that I find why Russians are quite cynical is the historical eras that they've been through. Just throughout history, there've been ups and downs, and there've been crises, and Russia flourished at some times, and it's just all the different eras that Russia's been through, and these are the eras that I'll be covering today. We're going to start from ancient Russia that dates back to the 9th century. I will talk about the Mongols and the emergence of Moscow, the Mongol invasion. I'll be talking about the Romanovs era, the Tsardom era, the Soviet era, the World War II, the Great, or as we call it, the Great Patriotic War, and I'll be talking about Russian Federation, as in Russian nowadays. So when we go back to ancient Russia, that goes back to the 9th century, the way Danes went to England or Norsemen went to Western Europe, Scandinavians, and to be more precise, the Varangians, the House of Rurich, led by the House of Rurich, went to Eastern Europe, and they've discovered a collection of cities, and they've discovered Kiev. So this is how Kievan Rus came to be. It wasn't exactly Russia at that time, it was called Kievan Rus. And it was Kievan Rus expanded quite immensely, and it grew in power under the rule of Vladimir the Great, and a written code of law was established. So Kievan Rus was thriving for about 300 years. They had really close relationship with Europe. The prince and princesses of Kievan Rus were marrying the prince and princesses of Europe, and this is the time when Kievan Rus established their religion. So there's a picture of Vladimir listening to the Orthodox priest, and this is the time when Vladimir the Great decided that he's going to go for Orthodox religion. He was tempted by the idea of Islam, because he liked the idea of having multiple wives, but then he realized that his men will not be able to survive without the hard liquor, and he went to Orthodox. That's not the only reason, but this is pretty much when Kievan Rus established their religion. The next era comes in Russia to Kievan Rus is the Mongols, the Mongol invasion and the emergence of Moscow. Now, I had an opportunity to do a Trans-Siberian railway trip from Helsinki through Russia, Mongolia, and down to China just about a year ago, and I had an opportunity to go to Mongolia and to see the traces of Genghis Khan. And it's quite fascinating how Mongols captured almost the entire world, including Russia. There was parts of India, China, and how they kept control of it. And when Mongols came to Russia, that was quite a political, economical distress for Russians, because they didn't know who they were. First of all, these were foreigners. They didn't know what language they spoke. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know what religion they were. So for 300 years, Russia was under Mongol control, and pretty much the strangers came to the country and took control of the entire population. So Kiev was destroyed, Moscow emerged as a capital city, and it was quite a distress. And if you can see, there's a picture of Mongol army capturing a Rus city. There was lots of cities that were burned down, lots of killings, lots of bloodshed. The good thing is that Mongols were tolerant for the religion. For Orthodox religion. So this is the time when Orthodox religion thrived in Russia. Orthodox religion grew stronger. But Russians, through the control of Mongols, adopted many ideas of government from the Chinese. Russia became more Asiatic nation in terms of government. And in general, Mongol invasion helped to determine the course of Russian culture and political geography. Eventually, Russia liberated themselves from Mongol invasion, and Europeans started coming to the country, and they start looking at Russian people that looked exactly the same. They looked like Europeans, but their ways, their manners, their tradition was completely different. So Europeans couldn't understand these weird Russians anymore. So another era that I would like to touch bases before we go on to the Romanovs era and the royalty era, I would like to talk about the serfdom in Russia. So this was going on from the 11th century till the 19th century. Russia owned slaves, serfs, but they were not some foreign people that were brought to the country. They were their own people, the Russians. The Russians lived in the feudal society, so peasants were turned into serfs. There was several degrees of feudal dependency of peasants, and serfdom became the dominant form of relationship between the peasants and nobility. In the 13th to 15th century, the amount of dependent peasants significantly increased, but the degree of slavery was not yet that severe. When landlords started owning the lands, the peasants had to pay money for the landlords just to stay in the land or to feed their families, and etc. And that level of dependency grew stronger, and they couldn't really afford to pay for their living conditions in the land. So they pretty much became dependent of the landlords and became their serfs. From the mid-15th century, the serfs still were entitled to 2 weeks each fall when they could freely leave their master after paying a certain fee, the fact of which was legalized in the Code of Law of 1497. But the 1649 Code of Law made most of the serfs the property of estates. So that was in the 17th century, when fleeing from from the masters was a criminal offense. From this point on, all serfs, no matter what their nominal category, were essentially slaves. So if we look into the numbers of the amount of people that were slaves, were serfs in Russia, to the comparison of the United States or UK, for example, Russia had 23 million slaves owned privately, privately, and then they were working for the state lands as well. By comparison to the US, they had 4 million slaves. And the British Empire at that time had 700,000, and Brazil 750,000 slaves. So the number, this is during the 19th century, the number of slaves in Russia was enormous. So pretty much most of the population of Russians were serfs. There were rebellions, of course. There were frequently rebellions erupted during that era, but the formula, the way the Russians functions at that time, was not making Russia any richer or stronger. They realized that their reforms needed to be made, the agriculture was very low, and they needed to start shaping a market economy. And eventually, the slavery was abolished in 1861 by Emperor Alexander II. But I will go back to that again, because this next interesting topic that I would like to cover is the Romanovs era. Now, of course, with the whole serfdom era, serfs in general were miserable throughout the history of Russia, and it was during the Romanovs dynasty. Even after their emancipation in 1861, their conditions barely improved. Eventually, their anger would contribute to the revolution that destroyed the Tsarist system and then enslaved them and tried to free them. So eventually, the serfs grew tired of the whole their lives, and even after the emancipation, their lives didn't improve. But we'll go back to that again. When we go back to the Romanovs era, Russia was liberated by the Romanovs, and the empire was run by Tsars. And not many Tsars before Peter the Great did a lot of things for Russia, really. So the first significant figure in Russian history who changed the course of history in Russia was Peter the Great. And you will be able to see lots of Peter the Great's monuments in St. Petersburg, because he is the founder of St. Petersburg. But he's one of the controversial figures in Russian history. He was the one who opened the window to Europe. He made Russia a new member of Europe. Russia was powerful during his reign. He made lots of improvements to education, schools, navy. He simplified Russian alphabet, Russian language. He even changed the way Russians were dressed, because Peter the Great was well-traveled. He traveled a lot to Europe, so he wanted to change up the dresses that men and women were wearing. And Russian men at that time were wearing long beards, but he didn't like it. He wanted everyone to be clean-shaved. So he introduced taxes on beard. Of course, men were not happy with that, but they eventually had to shave their beards and start wearing wigs and look like Europeans, I would say. So this was during Peter the Great's reign, and there was lots of things that he's done to the country. And of course, St. Petersburg became the capital of Russia during his reign, and he did lots of improvements for Russia. The next Tsarina, would say, was Peter's widow, Yekaterina I. After a brief struggle for power, Yekaterina was chosen to rule the country, thus becoming not only the empress, but also the first woman ever to head Russian empire, opening the legal path for a century almost entirely dominated by women. Russia at the time became involved in several lasting wars that sadly affected the financial situation of Russia. The next empress was Elizabeth. She is Peter the Great's daughter. She was supported greatly by the Russian National Army. Now, Elizabeth was Peter the Great's daughter, and he resembled him so much in many ways. She was active, resolute, very sociable. She presented the combination of Western trendiness and Russian conservativeness. Her policies were characterized by those same features of Peter the Great. He's created really good relations in Europe, and thanks to Elizabeth, the position of Russia on the international arena was strengthened greatly. She was unmarried, though, and she didn't have any children, but she needed to prepare the next heir to secure the Romanovs' dynasty, and she chose her nephew, Peter the Great's grandson, in the hope that the young man would be able to continue the policies and help Russia to avoid another economic crisis. So the next one was her nephew, Peter the Great's grandson, Peter III. Now, according to many historians, Peter was mentally immature and pro-Prussian. He grew up in Prussia and he lived there for a long time, so he was not really fond of Russians, and that made him quite unpopular amongst his own country. The emperor tried to pressure the Russian Orthodox Church and to adopt Lutheran practices, but he didn't rule for that long. The main conspirator was, curiously enough, Peter's wife. She, along with her lover, Grigory Orlov, was said to have wanted to overthrow him, and she eventually did. So Catherine the Great comes to power. The new empress, who was also called Catherine the Great, she possessed an unusual power of mind. She was immensely interested in history and philosophy, and she was considered to be one of the most highbrow and well-educated women of her time. She ruled Russia for 34 years and what will be called the Golden Age of Russian Empire. During her reign, Catherine the Great extended the borders of Russian Empire southwards and westwards, and she absorbed New Russia, Crimea, right bank Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. The next one who comes to power was poor, eccentric Emperor Pavel I, the son of Catherine the Great and her assassinated husband. Unfortunately, he was a complete opposite of Catherine the Great. He initiated severe censorship in the country, closed all private publishing houses, and banned the importation of foreign books. So, as you see in history of Romanovs, they had ups and downs. They had very liberal rulers, and some of them were complete opposites. Pavel he didn't share his mother's love for nobility. So the liberties and rights were limited, and that's why they didn't like him. The serfs, quite on the contrary, were finally allowed to lodge complaints. Peter's actions introduced a controversial reaction. The emperor managed to get on the wrong side of nobility, while the common people seemed to like the ruler more and more. But he grew very suspicious and distrustful, and that reached its peak in 1801 when he started accusing his family of wanting to kill him. And I think that's pretty much what happened. There's not much information about how he was killed, how he was assassinated, but some historians say that his son, Alexander I, might have been involved. So the next ruler is Alexander I. He ruled Russia for quite some time, about 24 years. And during his reign, 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. His army was nearly destroyed by the Russian winter weather. It's funny how Russian winter weather does not go well with people. The beginning of Alexander's reign was marked by a number of liberal reforms. So he was a liberal ruler once again. He relaxed censorship, he prohibited torture, he allowed peasants to buy their freedom from serfdom. He set up a Russian parliament, so he's done lots of great things, and he provided the country with a constitution. But his foreign policy was mainly concentrated with the relationship with France, and in 1810 this relationship turned into war, and initially the war between France and Russia broke out. And the result of the war was the defeat of French army, as I mentioned earlier, and Alexander I was considered to be the true savior of Russian Empire, while Napoleon was the oppressor of Europe and the disturber of the world's peace. And there's an interesting fact about his death. He's got quite a mysterious death. They say that he died, well, he had a cold, and then it got worse, and he died at the age of 47, but the evidence suggests that he faked his death because he grew tired of being a Tsar. He became very religious, and he felt like being a Tsar was such a burden to him, and he wanted to just live a solitary life. So when they opened his coffin in 1912, there was no one there. So some conspiracy theorists say that he just faked his death and lived as a holy man in Siberia. So that's an interesting fact about Alexander I. Now, he's greatly described in the book War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, if you had a chance to read this masterpiece. And he was greatly adored by Russian people, that there was not even one word, one criticism that was said towards Alexander I, how much they adored this man, and of course for saving the country from this oppressor of Europe, Napoleon. And there's lots of great descriptions in that book if you have a chance to read The War and Peace. The next ruler was Alexander II. He was also a great liberator, and he did lots of things to liberalize and modernize Russia. During his reign, slavery was abolished, 1861, and I think this was in US, the start of the Civil War. So that's approximately the same time as slavery was abolished in US as well. Unfortunately, the conditions didn't really improve, but because he gave so much freedom to people, people started forming revolutionary groups to overthrow the Russian Tsarist autocracy. And unfortunately, he was killed in the streets of St. Petersburg by a bomb thrown by a member of one of the revolutionary People's Will group that wanted to overthrow Russia's Tsarist autocracy. But the interesting fact is he was killed on the day when he signed the so-called Loris Melikov constitution that was possibly have become the germ of constitutional development in Russia, and would have maybe changed the entire course of history if he would have stayed alive. But unfortunately, he was killed on the same day when he signed this proclamation. So people say that he was a great historical figure without being a great man. Now, during his reign, he sold Alaska to the United States. Do you remember how much was it? He sold it for $7.2 million. Now, they say, I've actually did a lot of research about selling the Alaska, and apparently there's lots of conspiracies why Russia sold Alaska, what was the main reason, and how it all happened. And it's quite interesting, because I did, last summer I was out of Alaska, so that's why I started reading about it. And mainly the reason was because Russia had such a big territory already at that time, and they just couldn't control the Alaskan part. It was too far. They didn't have enough men to keep an eye on Alaska, and they actually knew that there was gold there, that there was great natural resources there. But because they didn't want to give it to UK, as per my resources, because UK might have taken it already at that time, Britain, they sold it to United States because at that time they had quite good relationships with the United States. So during Alexander II, this is when Alaska was sold. And to be honest, I think Russia wouldn't be able to take care of Alaska that well as the United States did at that period of time. So yes, there was a lot of expansions during Russia expanded during Alexander II reign, and that was all the way towards the east of Asia. The next ruler comes Alexander III. They call him the peacemaker for his foreign policies, because during his reign there was absolutely no wars with Russia. So Russia was not involved in any single major war. Russia's influence over Europe was generally accepted, and in one famous episode when Alexander was fishing, the Minister of Foreign Affairs came running to ask him if he would immediately see some Western power regarding an important issue, and Alexander replied, "When the Russian Tsar fishes, Europe can wait." So it was quite a good influence over Europe, and he was also known to be a very religious man. When it comes to his internal policies, he was considered a tyrant and oppressor. And I'll tell you more in details about it later, because he was so convinced that Russian Empire would be a thriving, successful empire under the Orthodox Church and ruled by Russians and only Russian and the Orthodox religion. Even there were stories about his travel. So once him and his family traveled in a train, and that train derailed and crashed, killing 20, 30 people, and the only survivors was his family. So that's why he was considered as a holy man, that the God saved him in this terrible tragedy. But when it comes to his internal policies, he was quite a tyrant and oppressor, and he weakened the Judaism. So there was a persecution of the Jews. He banned Jews from inhabiting rural areas. They couldn't get certain jobs, so they were restricted when it comes to different occupations they could get engaged in. So he was quite a tyrant, and there was lots of anti-Semitic reforms he's done. And the next ruler and the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty was Nicholas II. He ascended the throne when he was 26-year-old, quite a young man, and his other nickname is also known as Nicholas the Bloody. He was held responsible for the Bloody Sunday by the public. On Sunday, 22nd January 1905, an unarmed demonstration marched towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It's the big square there you'll be able to see. They wanted to have him sign the petition regarding the problems faced by the working class. The problems like wages, working hours, working conditions. So that was a very harmful, unarmed demonstrations. And the soldiers of the Imperial Guard fired on the demonstration. Although the officials say there was only 92 people killed, but it estimated more than 1,000 people were killed, or dead or wounded during that demonstration. And that's why he was called Nicholas the Bloody. And of course, that led to lots of strike movements in Russia that eventually will lead to the October Revolution and the end of Romanov's dynasty. By early 1917, Russia was on the verge of total collapse, with the massive rioting, rebellions, and soaring prices, and the February Revolution forced Nicholas II to relinquish his authority, marking the end of Russian Empire at the Romanov dynasty, which ruled Russia for 3 centuries. On 17th July 1918, Tsar Nicholas and his wife Tsarina Alexandra and their 5 children were executed by Bolsheviks under the order of Ural Soviet. They were shot by revolvers in the basement. I had a chance to be in Yekaterinburg when I did my Trans-Siberian trip, and I had a chance to see the church because Nicholas II later on and his wife were made saints. And it's a beautiful church that has all the pieces of the house where they lived, because eventually, when the revolution came, the entire Romanovs family moved out from the capital and they started living peaceful life in Siberia, and they accepted the reality that there was no more royalty anymore. And and it's so sad to hear that it was such a beautiful family. They truly loved each other. There's lots of books that were written about the love of Nicholas II to his wife, and their children. And it was such a beautiful, peaceful family. And unfortunately, this was a terrible thing to do from the Bolsheviks, to execute the entire family. But at that time, Bolsheviks did not know other ways. They were truly convinced that that was the only way to move on to the new society, to the new socialist society. And also an interesting fact that I found out just a year ago, that Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Nicholas II, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And in a way, because back in the days, the Romanovs, the royalty, of course, the Romanovs and the European prince and queens and princesses were in close relations with each other. So it was an interesting fact for me to find out that the wife of Nicholas II was related to the royalty, the British royalty. So the execution happened, and the revolution happened in Russia, and that happened in 1917. The bond between the Tsar and the most of the Russian people has been broken. Government was corrupted and inefficient. The Tsar's reactionary policies, including the occasional dissolution of Duma and Russian parliament, led to this revolution. People were totally driven by the idea of communism and socialism, and Lenin being the leader of the entire revolution, people sacrificed life. This was a big idea in people's mind. Total equality with no rich, no poor, no private ownership. They loved the idea of free medical care, free education, and there was all working class pretty much that supported Lenin. They were quoting Lenin. Eventually, they started learning communism in schools. My parents studied communism at school. All the private properties were nationalized by the government. All the Russian banks were nationalized. The properties of church were expropriated. So control of the factories was totally given to the Soviets. Wages were fixed at higher rates than during the war. The 8-hour working class was 8-hour working day was introduced. So everything was made for the working class. It was great living conditions for the working class. My parents grew up during the Soviet era, and they're telling me all these stories, and they were pretty happy during that era. They didn't travel abroad. That's all they see. They saw that everyone were equal. There was not much gaps between the rich and poor. Everyone were poor. So they stood in long queues for food, simple food items. There was not much food options in the market. The market economy was not developed. So all they did, just basic food products, and they need to queue up for that. And eventually they grew tired of the whole queuing up, and they stood, my dad and my mom, they stood in queues for hours just to get basic food items, bread, flour, meat, milk, and they started having jokes going around when there's a joke I can tell you about the long queues. There's two men standing in this long queue in Russia for a piece of bread, and one man gets so frustrated and he says, "I'm so sick of standing in this long queue, I'm gonna go and kill Khrushchev." Khrushchev was one of the party leaders at that time after Stalin. So he leaves and he comes back in about a couple of hours, even more frustrated, and his friend is asking, "So, did you manage to kill Khrushchev?" He says, "Can you believe there's even a longer line to kill Khrushchev?" Just to describe how frustrated everyone was. Of course, people lived, they were happy, they were marrying, they fell in love. Interesting fact about the jeans, the things, foreign items like jeans, Beatles record, foreign music, was so hard to get. They would get them in black market somewhere undercover. My mom would listen to the Beatles record somewhere in the basement with her friends because it was all forbidden. They would buy jeans somewhere in the hidden locations from a friend. So they still managed to survive, and I still ask my mom, how did you live when you go shopping and you really don't have any options to buy clothes? They would have very simple material available, very similar dresses to everyone, so everyone pretty much looked the same. And then she said, I found my ways. She liked to dress up as well, my mom, so she would find her tailor, and then a couple of friends that lived in Uzbekistan down in the south, they would bring some new materials that she could give her tailor and create some new stuff. So people found their ways to be classy and modern. People got married. The interesting fact about the weddings, if you see in this picture, there was not much cafes and restaurants people could afford, so they would connect the tables in the small apartments and celebrate with vodka and caviar. That's pretty much the celebration of the weddings. So there's another joke that I have about the communism and just the thought how, well, Soviet Union was quite a closed-off country. No one could really go to Soviet Union and see what it was, and the same for the Russian people. They couldn't really see what's happening outside of the world. And there's three men arguing about the ethnicity of Adam and Eve. There's a joke. So an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a communist are arguing about the ethnicity of Adam and Eve. And Frenchman says, I'm sure Adam and Eve were French because only a French lady would give away paradise for her love. And the British man says, no, I'm sure Adam and Eve were British because only a British gentleman would give away paradise for his lady. And the communist says, wait, they were communists. I've got triple proof for that. First of all, they had no clothing. Secondly, they had one apple to share. And third of all, they truly believed they were in paradise. So it's a little joke to demonstrate the life of communist people. The next era, which is a very significant era in the Russian history, is the World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as we call it. 1939, the World War II begins. Russia invades Poland in an agreement with Germany. 1941, Germany invades Russia. 1942, Russian army defeats the German army at the Battle of Stalingrad, and this was a major turning point of the World War II. And it was such a big historical event for Russian men and Russian women that it stays so deeply in the heart of every Russian. It's been more than 70 years since the Victory Day, but the 9th of May is the day when the entire Russia celebrates just a memory of the fallen. 20 million Russian lives were lost in the Second World War, and I'm sure there's lots of the number is endless when it comes to other countries that participated in this war. But at that time, the war was in the land of Russia, so people were fighting for their families, they were protecting their children, and we do have all these stories that comes from generation to generation, from our grandfather, and we tell this to our children, and we will keep telling these stories to our grandchildren about how much sacrifice they made during the Second World War. We used to have big parades. Well, we still do have big parades, and we would have veterans marching on the streets, but there's not much veterans left anymore. So we started doing this immortal regiment, the parades, that were taking place in the streets of Russia on the 9th of May, the Victory Day, when the entire street is filled with people with the portraits of their relatives, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, grandmothers that were fallen or killed or participated in the Second World War. So it's quite a touching topic for myself as well. I've got my grandfather, my great-grandfather that died in the Second World War. And when I saw the letter about my grandfather, and that's my father's father, who survived the war, when he went to the war, he was in his early 20s. He was very young, he was super strong, very tall man. He was 2 meters tall. But he was captured and he was kept in the concentration camp, and he actually ran away a couple of times. And this piece of paper states all the concentration camps he's been to, because they've been transferring him closer to Germany. And eventually he escaped, and after the 3rd attempt he escaped the concentration camp, and then he was found by the partisans, the army that was hiding in the forest. And of course he continued fighting in the Second World War till it was over. But then, because Stalin was in power, they they had so-called filtration, when everyone who was kept in the concentration camp was suspected of treason. So they took him to prison, they questioned him, he spent there for about a year. I don't know what they did to him, he never told the story to his dad what they really did to him, but I'm sure there was horrible things. And then they let him go, and he went back home. He had 8 children. With my grandma, and unfortunately he died at the age of 50 of the heart attack. And this is one of the stories that will keep going with generation and generation of the sacrifices they've made. This is my great-grandfather Rahimyan and my great-grandfather Alexander. Alexander was a war photographer, so he was a journalist during the wartime. And Rahimyan, my great-grandfather from my mother's side, unfortunately died in one of the battlefields in 1942. But he's been writing those letters to his wife, and we still keep those letters. They're triangle-shaped letters, and he was writing to his wife that he was laying on this cold ground, and it was terrible. He wouldn't want anyone to see what he's going through, and please protect the children, because they were already growing up to be eligible to be called to the army. He said, please protect my children, do not let them see this war, break their fingers, arms, legs, but do not let them see this. And unfortunately he died in one of the battlefields and was never found. They say it was probably the Battle of Stalingrad that he most likely was in. So these are the stories that will never die in the heart of every Russian, and it's a very emotional thing for every Russian. The Remembrance Day is the 9th of May for every Russian. So this was a very significant era in Russian history. And of course this post-war era, which was quite a difficult era as well, because Russia was broken. Though they did capture most of the Europe going back, Russia was broken, the territories were broken, but they still managed to get involved in the Cold War. So this is the start of the Cold War, when the two big powers were trying to measure their muscles and show off how great they were. And this is the time when USSR developed lots of technologies. They were, first of all, of course, the education, medical care was free, but they did also lots of scientific and industrial improvements, and also in the space industry. Unfortunately, after the post-war, Stalin's repressions and the purge, Stalin's purge did not end. Because of him, there were 20 million other people that died. And even if he was a big hero for ending the Second World War, the truth came out later about the purge and all the persecution of the opposition that he did. He sent so many people to Siberia, the camp called Gulag. If you had a chance to read Solzhenitsyn, a Nobel Prize winner author, he describes the concentration, the camp Gulag, archipelago Gulag, about all the Russians, all the political criminals, everyone who was sent by Stalin to Siberia, to these camps. Just read it. I would highly recommend. It's very emotional as well, and quite. There's descriptions that he does about the entire camp system and how people were persecuted there. It's just terrible, but he tells us the truth because he was there. So I would highly recommend for you to read this book, Archipelago Gulag by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So USSR had lots of achievements that, of course, all the Russians are very proud. There was a twin-engined, medium-range, narrow-body, turbojet-powered Soviet airliner, and the world's first successful jet airliner that was built during Soviet Union time. They had Sputnik 1 was the first artificial Earth satellite. The Soviet Union launched into an elliptical low Earth orbit on October 4th, 1957. Yuri Gagarin, of course, the star of Soviet Union. He was a Russian-Soviet pilot and a cosmonaut, the first human to journey into outer space when his Vostok spacecraft completed an orbit for the Earth on 12th of April, 1961. We're very proud of Valentina Tereshkova, also a Soviet cosmonaut, the first woman in space and the first civilian in space. And all of these achievements, of course, in space and nuclear power, energy, all of these achievements were made during the USSR. The idea of communism eventually crushed in the hearts of people. As I mentioned earlier, when they found out the truth about Stalin and what he did to people, that crushed the idea, because Stalin was almost like a god to people. It was almost like a religious belief. And when they found out he was such a bad person, killing so many innocent people, the people's ideas crushed. They didn't know who else to believe anymore. So I think in that era, Russian people became more cynical, and they didn't know who else to believe anymore. But there was no religion during communist era. There was no God. Some families still kept their religion going strong, but that was hidden. That was not open amongst people. So people became quite cynical in that era, and they realized that there's no such thing as total equality. They realized that the idea of communism was a utopian idea, and eventually the corruption was introduced. There was a big gap between rich and poor, and there was a need of market economy. And Mikhail Gorbachev was the one that actually started democratization of Russia. He started perestroika, and this is when I was born, the year 1989, when he introduced perestroika, the restructuring of the entire government system. He opened glasnost, which means openness. There was no much control of speech anymore. People could openly speak, not that much open, but they still could express their ideas. He ended the Cold War. He let the Western Europe free of communism. The Berlin Wall fell at that time, and he received Nobel Prize for that. He's done lots of things to develop foreign policies of Russia, and of course the end of Cold War significantly changed the image of Russia. But eventually he was not really liked much by Russians. Russians didn't like him, though the foreign world really appreciated what he's done, but the Russians didn't really appreciate his policies. First of all, he wanted to end alcoholism in Russia because people were just drinking all day long. And what he decided to do is he decided to cut off all the wineries in Sochi, in the Black Sea area. That was the silliest decision ever. You will never stop a Russian from drinking. They started making their own moonshine and samagon, we call it, just homemade vodka out of sugar. So they found their ways, but they really got angry at Mikhail Gorbachev. Another slide that I've added to this presentation, I've never had it before, but it's because just recently I was so affected by the series that I watched about Chernobyl, and that happened during Mikhail Gorbachev being in power in 1986. And I just didn't realize how bad the catastrophe was. And if you have a chance to watch it, it just came out on HBO. It's called Chernobyl, and it's so well done. Actually, you could see the true Soviet Russia there. All the details, the plates, the furniture, how people spoke to each other is so well done. So I'd highly recommend to watch that series. It's very difficult to watch as well. It's about the Chernobyl disaster that is considered to be the worst nuclear power plant accident in history of the world, in terms of casualties and costs and how many people were killed there. And unfortunately, you could see the mindsets of people, and they could have prevented the death of so many people if only they would have not been so obsessed of their own status. At that time, Russia was just so obsessed of not being criticized by the Western world, and they just didn't want to accept the tragedy for so many days and so many hours. They could have prevented the deaths of so many people. So I would recommend for you to watch it if you have a chance. The next era that I would like to talk about, we're going towards the end of the presentation, is the Russian Federation as in Russia nowadays. This is where I live, this is where I grew up. The democracy was introduced in 1991, and it's actually younger than myself. I was born in 1989, and the democracy in Russia is quite young. And if you ask me if I really think that we do have a democracy in Russia, I would tell you not yet. Because democracy is something that is born within people. It should come with generations to generations. Right now, people who are ruling the world, they grew up in the communist society with a communist mindset, with different system in place. So right now, the mindset is not quite there. I know the younger generation, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years, in a couple of generations, people will start understanding what the democracy is all about, the freedom of speech, and that the liberties of the people, and the market economy in general, and all of this. I'm hoping it would get better. It is getting better if you compare Russia 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Of course, it's getting better. People are more open to democracy. The first ever president elected in the 1,000 years of history was 1991, Boris Yeltsin. And people first time went on election. They had no idea what elections was till 1991. Can you imagine? Of course, they were cynic. They were very skeptical. What is election? I thought it's already been decided. All right, I'll go and vote. So that's the mindset of people when they elected Boris Yeltsin. And I've chosen this particular picture of Boris Yeltsin because he was quite an alcoholic. First elected president in the 1,000 years of history. He did introduce the capitalist market economy, but unfortunately the economy, there was an economic collapse during his presidency. National property fell into the hands of oligarchs, who call them the super rich people of Russia, that took advantage of that period of time when big national properties like oil rigs, big coal mining companies fell into the hands of the oligarchs and they took ownerships of that. There was lots of corruption, inflation. There was an economical collapse, and unfortunately, his drinking addiction didn't help. So, he started it all, and we're all grateful to him. But he left Russia in such a economical collapse. And he left it to his successor, Vladimir Putin, that came to power in 2000 and still is a president, and I've already lost track of count how long he's a president. That's been quite some time. But this is how we see him in Russian media. I'm going to leave my opinion out of this. He's done lots of things internally for Russia. There was lots of good reforms that he's done for Russia. There was lots of good reforms for teachers, for scientists, for policemen, for educational programs and everything. There was good reforms done for medicine program. And it's still growing. And when it comes to internal policies, I think Russia's changed a lot. But the system's still not quite there. The system is still not democratic. And I get frustrated sometimes when I go to a government building and I need to fill out some paperwork, or if I need to do something, and sometimes it does resemble me of the communists there, and I get frustrated. It's like, why am I supposed to do this? We're not in the communist society. And then I realize, oh wait, I should give some time to Russia. So, and then I'm gonna let you decide what you think about his foreign policies. I'm not gonna comment on that. And of course, the other subject that I would like to touch bases of is St. Petersburg. The place where you're going is my favorite city in Russia. Lots of Russians do adore St. Petersburg. It's a beautiful cultural center. It's a cultural capital of Russia. Lots of theaters, ballet performance. Just the architecture on its own is beautiful, and I think Peter the Great has done a great job creating the city. It was built on the river Neva, so it has the deepest subway. So if you have a chance to ride a metro, and I think some of the tours go there, it's just endless. It goes down and down and down. It's absolutely beautiful. It's also considered to be a hero city because St. Petersburg was under siege in the Second World War for 900 days by the Nazis, starved to death. There's so many people that died, and at that time it was called Leningrad. And then eventually was liberated. So that's why it's considered to be a hero city. It's a busy city, but they all say it's such a polite cultural city. Even the pickpocketers are super polite. They'll come to you and they'll say, "Excuse me, can I just take your money?" No, I'm joking. Well, of course, in all the big cities, they've got the pickpocketers, so please be careful. It's not as busy as Moscow, because Moscow is, of course, a metropolitan city, and it does remind me of New York a little bit, just the way people rush always somewhere. There's a joke about New York City, and this is pretty much the same for Moscow as well. There's a guy from Alabama comes to New York City, and he approaches one of the guy and he says, "Excuse me, do you know where the Empire State Building?" And he says, "Yeah, I know," and just keeps walking. So that will be pretty much the same for Moscow as well. But it's beautiful. St. Petersburg is beautiful. Younger generation would now speak a bit more English, but the older generation does not speak English that much. When it comes to currency, it's actually a great exchange rate. It used to be, before the sanctions come on, it used to be $30 rubles per dollar. Now the deal is you get 62 rubles per dollar. So it's great for me because I get paid in dollars. So I get twice as much money as normally, but it's a bit, of course, it's not that great for the people who wants to travel abroad from Russia and exchange dollars. But that's the money exchange rate at this point, about 62, 61 rubles per dollar. You can pay with the credit cards as well, and I know I do get questions about that. You can pay with your credit cards everywhere. It's a European city, so you can pay everywhere. Beautiful places that I would suggest for you to see is the Peterhof Palace, and I know some of the tours go absolutely beautiful. It's a summer residence of the Tsars. There's beautiful cathedrals, the streets, the palaces, the canals. The bridge is going to open at night, and you are quite lucky because June is considered to be the time of the white nights in St. Petersburg. So it doesn't get dark at all. So at night, it will be like a daylight. So it's absolutely beautiful and romantic. So I would like to finish off this presentation with a person that inspired me to do this presentation. And he's a very famous, my hero. I absolutely adore him. I follow him on Instagram. I follow all his articles. I read all of his articles, and he's just genius. He's a very famous Russian journalist. Vladimir Posner, and I was inspired by his book called Parting with Illusions. Some of the Americans actually might know him because he was born in France. He lived in US. Then when he was 18, he went back to Soviet Union. But then when he was about 60, 50 years old, he hosted a TV show in US as well when he talked about Soviet Union. So he speaks perfect English, he speaks perfect French, he speaks perfect Russian, and he wrote this book called Parting with Illusions, and I absolutely liked it. It's an autobiographical book when he writes about his life, but his vision of Soviet Union era from a perspective of a foreigner is absolutely hilarious. He's great because he doesn't have a mindset of a Soviet Union person. He goes to Soviet Union in his 20s. He grew up in US with his French mom, and he has seen the market economy, of course, in US. And then when he goes back to the United States, he starts absolutely new life there. So he establishes himself as a journalist, and he's one of the free-spoken journalists that we've got in Russian media. And not many of them are allowed to speak freely, but the way he does it is just, I'm surprised he's still allowed in the federal channel. He doesn't have a prime time though, he comes on midnight, but I don't mind staying up late and watch his programs at midnight. So that would be the book that I would recommend for you to watch. It's called Parting with Illusions. He wrote it in English and then he translated it 20 years later. He wrote it in Russian. I read it in Russian. So I highly recommend for you if you'd like to learn more about the Soviet Union time, and it's very interesting. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much for joining. And if you have any questions, I'll stay here. If you've got any questions about St. Petersburg, I'm happy to answer those questions. Thanks for joining. Have a great day. Thank you. Спасибо.